I'll start doing. So, hello everyone. Thanks again. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, thank you for being here for the third lecture in the series, Spaces of Containment and Care. And the series is aiming to reflect on the spatial politics of infectious diseases and health. My name is Nida Rahman. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an assistant professor in the School of Architecture at CMU. The series is also supported by the CMU Center for Arts in Society, where I'm currently directing a project under a 3-year initiative called Borderlines. And before we get started, I just want to take a quick pause with all of you to reflect on the violence that we've seen in the last couple of days, and especially to take a moment of silence for the 8 victims, including the Asian sex workers in Atlanta, and also to express support and solidarity for members of the Asian and Asian American and Pacific Islander communities here in Pittsburgh and elsewhere, who have been obviously deeply shaken by this latest in a long string of episodes of misogyny, white supremacy, xenophobia, racism. Okay, and in the chat, I've included some links for organizations you can support, as well as another link to a vigil, which is going to be held today at 6:30 here at CMU, if you would like to participate and show your support. And as many of you are aware, the violence that we are seeing today has a very long history, which includes the Chinese Exclusion Act. It includes the criminalization of sex work, the ways in which Asian immigrants and workers in particular have been sort of pathologized, the intrusion into and the destruction of their communities, often on the grounds of sanitary and public health measures. And our speaker today, Susan Craddock, has explored many of these themes in her work. Susan, I'm really delighted to welcome you here today. Susan is professor at the Institute of Global Studies at the University of Minnesota. In her work, she examines the social and political determinations of risk to ill health, and in particular to infectious diseases such as tuberculosis, COVID-19, HIV, and influenza, and particularly the convergence of financial, political, and scientific factors that shape how diseases are responded to. So her work really centers on the kind of intertwined relationships of public health and social, national, and territorial politics. Her latest book, Compound Solutions, Pharmaceutical Alternatives for Global Health, examines the role of product development partnerships in developing new drugs and vaccines for tuberculosis. And she's also the author of City of Plagues, Disease, Poverty, and Deviance in San Francisco. She's the co-editor of HIV and AIDS in Africa, Beyond Epidemiology, and Influenza and Public Health, Learning from Past Epidemics. In City of Plagues, she looks at how explanations and discourses about infectious disease have tended to center and continue to center, and very negatively so, people who are at society's margins, people who might be considered socially or sexually deviant, so immigrants, non-white populations, the homeless, sex workers, etc. And she also has looked at the ways in the physical and material effects that policies which are based on these kinds of explanations have on people's lives. So that line that connects the kind of Trumpian logic of the China virus to the very traumatic events, the gender, class, and race-based violence that we've seen more recently against already marginalized Asian sex workers. That line, I think clearly we see it in how, as Susan writes, disease intensifies the rhetoric of hatred, fear, and blame utilized against undesirable populations. And that's a line from City of Plagues. So I'm very, very delighted to welcome her here. Susan, thank you for taking time to be with us. And before I pass it on, just a couple of quick notes, which is to please, in case you're not already muted, please do ensure that you are for the duration of the talk, so there's no distractions. We'll have a good amount of time at the end for question and answer. But also I encourage anyone to use the chat function to post questions. And we're recording the talk, and it will be available on the YouTube channel for the Center for Arts and Society. So with that, please join me for a really warm welcome for Susan Craddock. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, everybody. And first of all, thank you, Nita, for the warm welcome and for inviting me to participate in this. I had a really great experience in your class at the end of last semester, and so I'm happy to be back in contact with you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with my PowerPoint. And I will take it from there. Can everybody see that, or should I leave it in the smaller version, the non-slide version? Is that good with everybody?
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay. All right. So what I want to talk about today, within this theme of the spaces of care and containment, is the context-driven and variable nature of when spaces and structures are caring spaces and when they are not, when they're the opposite. And more specifically, I want to examine the relationship, which is what I've done my entire career, as Nita just described, the relationship among public health measures, which are designed to contain pathogens, the spaces and architectures broadly defined of those measures, and the global or national economic contexts that shape them. My main argument for this talk is that we need to think harder about who precisely is benefiting from the scientific and public health measures or innovations coming out of this and being implemented, and who is not. This is a question, again, I have asked throughout my career, and it unfortunately remains as relevant as it did 25 years ago. And why those particular patterns? Or another way to put it, which is by far not the first time or the 100th time, but it is that pandemics make more glaring the ugly underbellies of our societies, of where the fault lines are, and what causes them. And I think we have a moment, an opportunity, as people started writing about a long time ago, it seems like a long time ago, earlier in the epidemic, an opportunity to not just observe the magnitude of these inequities and inequalities, but to think about what we need to actually do for positive change. What is it? This is a moment where so many things have been ground to a halt. Is it our window to do something more dramatic than we often think is possible when things are running normally, so-called? Can we learn from this pandemic and actually make these changes rather than just let this window close again, which I'm afraid is already happening. So so I want my disclaimer here is that this is not a one research project for me. And so what I would really love to do is just I'm going to provide 3 case studies of varying scales, geographic scales of what of spaces of containment that can be care, but often are not in these changing situations. And I really would love to just generate a conversation of those questions that I just asked. You know, what can we, to me, from my perspective, there is, like for so many, this frustration of you write about these over and over again and nothing happens. And we need to learn from pandemics and epidemics and not much happens. And so that's the conversation that I would like to generate, not that we can save the world, but just to have a productive conversation. I want to share a framework that I find helpful for this, and that is that in their recent book, Pathological Lives, Steve Henschliff, Nick Bingham, John Allen, and Simon Carter argue that pathogens alone do not cause outbreaks. They're needed, but that's not what causes outbreaks. What causes them and what makes pathogens actually become pathogenic is through the interrelations of an array of material, human, non-human, economic, social, historical, and cultural factors. One of the fundamental points of Henschliff and his colleagues' framing of disease is to suggest the need to get beyond seeing disease as present or absent. And they start with Foucault's term pathological life, which argues that around the turn of the 19th century, which figures much in Foucault, disease was no longer an external threat to life, but it had become a part of life. With better understandings of viral processes, the porous nature of bodies, and a persistent spectrum of compromised health in early industrial 19th century cities, disease as a circumscribed entity was less accurate than, quote, the much denser notion of pathological life. So Henschliff and his colleagues expand on this notion to come to a, quote, more continuous, less dichotomous sense of health, one where the makings of even infectious disease spread do not suddenly appear from out there, which is what the common discourses always are, and the narratives, but rather they are built into the social and economic infrastructures of urban and rural life, but I'm focusing on the urban, and mobilize in particular disease situations, as they put it. So my first case study focuses on the fact that housing takes on new meanings and too often more pathological ones when interventions considered best practice, and please know I'm not saying we need to get rid of them, but to think deeply about them and their implications. So these measures in public health emergencies contain within them, even with the benefits, they contain within them their own paths to death, debility, and disease. So the implicit assumption in lockdowns is that houses or homes are safe spaces, and many of them are, millions of them are, where families or partners function together as best they can within reasonably comfortable confines of rooms and protective walls. And from the outside, during lockdowns, the outside walls signify protective barriers, keeping people out who unknowingly harbor pathogens, or protecting those inside from protecting other people. But what we hear less about are the ways in which homes under COVID and other pandemics contain spaces of violence along a number of axes. So first is that the level of critical mental distress from isolation, lack of support networks, losing jobs, facing evictions, food security, etc., has spiked significantly. And according to the Kaiser Family Foundation, it spikes from 1 in 10 adults expressing concern about mental health in January through June of 2019, up to 41% of adults. And as with As with many facets of COVID, this is not evenly distributed across categories. So you have that age range. Young adults are at the most risk. That job status has to do with it, and you know, none of this is super surprising, but yet I think the graphs and the numbers can still be compelling. Income, not surprisingly, had bearing on level of mental distress. And this maps onto communities of color who show higher rates of mental distress, with 58% of Blacks, 46% of Latinx reporting symptoms of anxiety and or depression. And finally, it's gendered. More women express than others. So second, health experts know that intimate partner violence increased under lockdown. But in this case, sheltering at home not only increases chances of physical, emotional, and psychological violence, but it also prevents reporting or reaching out for help because of the close proximity. So as Megan Evans and her colleagues discussed in their recent article in the New England Journal of Medicine, that hotlines prepared for a spike of calls after the March 2020 lockdown, only to then report a 50% reduction. And they realized, well, this is why women can't call even when they're experiencing violence, because of course their perpetrators are right there and they're not going anywhere. The same authors remind us that lockdowns also reduce alternative and safer housing arrangements, such as shelters, which have had to reduce their own populations or shut down, and that clinics and hospitals can serve as places where abuse can be discovered, and if patients want, can at least get counseling and resources and alternatives. But those are also often not accessible right now. So inequity also plays a role here too, with the authors stating that, quote, privilege, finances, and access to resources all affect the impact of intimate partner violence on patients. The most extreme example of domestic violence against women is in the form of femicide, but as the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Dubravka Simonovic, recently talked about in a March 4th webinar on the topic, the numbers, she knows for sure that of course many more women were killed during so far under COVID and under lockdowns, but the numbers are not there. And her work, she talked about, is trying to get numbers there, that sometimes it's tucked under murders, all murders, sometimes they simply don't count it. And so it's hard to get a sense of exactly how many has happened. But I do have a graduate student, Tankut Atuk, who had some numbers for Turkey. So just during the days between the 11th and 31st of March 2020, 20 women were murdered, 18 of them within the so-called safety of home. And between March 2019 and March 2020, there was a 40% increase in recorded incidences of domestic violence, from 1,804 to 2,493. And as usual, we know that that is a significant undercount for the reasons I just stated. Domestic spaces during lockdown also become centers of food insecurity, where severe deprivation happens especially. So it's increased everywhere in the world, including the United States. So as both Agnes Kalibata, the special food envoy to the UN, and the World Food Program have indicated, lockdowns have prevented many farmers from growing food. Of course, they're also under lockdown. So that impacts, of course, down the stream. With food availability and food pricing and distribution problems, supply chain problems. So in addition, millions confined to their homes have lost their jobs, and they are not able to look for jobs or get other jobs, leaving them without necessary funds for feeding themselves and their children. So this is a headline from The Guardian, newspaper about the United States. Again, it's not just an out there problem. And the headline was, I don't have money for food. Millions of unemployed in the US are left without benefits, including any kind of money to be able to feed their children and keep a roof over their heads. And so just in Minnesota, the food insecurity is up 60% to unprecedented levels, with BIPOC families at least twice as likely as white families to be living with hunger. So you can't see here, it used to be 1 in 11, it's now 1 in 9 Minnesotans are facing hunger. But for millions without access to food banks, which we do have a fairly robust system of food banks that are ramping up their efforts, so our communities themselves have been fantastic about ramping up their own efforts. We have a wonderful initiative in North Minneapolis, which is predominantly African-American, called Appetite for Change, which uses food and growing food into a window of economic justice and racial justice. And they have been able to really ramp up and get food out to their community. But it doesn't cover everybody. For those millions without access to food banks or support, the outcomes are, of course, much more dire, with one recent Lancet article estimating an additional 6.7 million children under 7 will or have experienced wasting by the end of 2020 because of the lost incomes and restrictions in movement, et cetera. Finally, for so many millions of families and individuals in the United States and elsewhere, in highly precarious situations, containment and certainly care has either very little relevance. Homeless populations have been almost absent in the news or anything else during COVID of, what is happening, or at least it has been in the Twin Cities and the sources that I read every day. Or it means further risk of exposure, if not to COVID, then to pandemics like tuberculosis that have continued silently every year to kill or debilitate millions. A report from Access to Medicine's Foundation predicts that lockdowns coupled with disruptions in healthcare systems because of COVID will add at least 1.5 million to tuberculosis deaths globally over the next 5 years. This is Darby, which I will also say has generated many times in these crisis situations, initiatives are generated, but that nevertheless doesn't take them outside of the risk of, again, tuberculosis. And another point here is not just that people are more exposed to tuberculosis, but even more exposed because TB, even though, and I'm not at all discounting the millions being affected and dying of COVID, that tuberculosis is one of those diseases that it kills 1.4 million every year, every single year, and it's gone down very little over the last decades. And it's that silent epidemic that continues. And because money that already is not adequate to be addressing tuberculosis, some of that is now being channeled into COVID, then that gets its own setback. And that can't really be caught up. So lockdowns mean drops in already inadequate coverage of preventive health services, vaccination, antenatal care programs, children not going to school and potentially not returning to school, spikes in lead exposures, if you saw that recent headline, because of halts in removal programs, spikes in cancers and diabetes and other chronic diseases because people are not going in for screening or their treatments. So relevant for so much of this, of what is happening, is Rob Nixon's notion of slow violence, which I find so apt for so many different situations, where he argues not just that we need to see the violence in everyday lives that is not spectacular, that's happening with, and I certainly want to come back to this, to modes of capitalism that is not about care. It's about the opposite. But he argues also that we need to see the timeline of many of these violences, that they're not going to end when COVID is finally over, that they might not be, many of these people might not die a spectacular death of COVID that does get counted, but whose debilitations or deficits from responses to COVID will linger for many, many years, if not a lifetime. So this leads me to my second but related case, which is that I want to bring attention not to the aftermaths of responses, but to the antecedents and current historical, financial, political relations determining coordinates of containment or care, or in this case, their opposites at the municipal level. In an essay by Nikhil Anand entitled "The Banality of Infrastructure," which he says that he got that term from Susan Lee Starr, a science studies scholar, he talks about the contradictions of urban infrastructure, both being boring, nothing much exciting about sewers and that sort of thing, yet at the same time a key site for the, quote, making of urban inequality and inclusion, and a pervasive sign, not just in cities of the global South, but in the US, of frayed social contracts. So whether he's talking about levees collapsing, bridges falling, water systems failing, or power grids shutting down, Texas recently, Anand argues that these, quote, are not only sites for performances of environmental injustice, they also reveal how infrastructures operate with multiple temporalities that distribute life and harm. As they accrete and distribute resources over time, infrastructures call for an accounting of the world that recognizes how past histories of injustice are remade and realized anew. So I want to suggest, first of all, as I said, I want to define infrastructure very broadly to include not just the urban neighborhoods and architectures, bridges and facilities, but also wage and legal structures historically and currently in place, because these have also been incredibly important in preparing the ground and providing the right combination of factors, a la Hinchliffe, to come together and create very disparate, extremely disparate COVID rates that we're seeing here in the United States. So in the United States, the disparity began being found in cities where physicians noticed that conditions such as diabetes, heart conditions, hypertension, asthma were all risk factors for higher COVID-19 case and hospitalization rates. So where does that come from? How does that come about? So the one where I want to start is to look at what is, again, not new to anybody, but you might think, well, what does this have to do with COVID? Is redlining and covenants. There's a really exciting program going on right now at the University of Minnesota called the Mapping Prejudice. It's a citizen historian project where people can come and go through the archives of all of these covenants in the 1920s. This is St. Paul is the one you're seeing more forefronted. Minneapolis is the other one. These covenants that everybody knows exist and they're there, but they haven't read them and mapped them, where these covenants talk about this is who can live. White people can only live in this neighborhood. Okay, now they can only live in this neighborhood too. And then from there, the more strict legalized redlining began in the 1930s. And so from the 20s to 1968, when the Second Fair Housing Act finally made it illegal, this is one of the factors that illustrates Anand's mention of injustice remade and realized anew, because of course, this didn't stop happening as soon as it became illegal. Of course, it continued. Not only did it continue in practice under the radar, so to speak, but by this time, people were entrenched and in their neighborhoods. And when deprivation starts, it has its cascading effects, that you put people in neighborhoods and you make sure through the so-called Fair Housing Act that was meant to get families in owning more houses, to accumulate wealth, to give them a good head start. And at the same time, even that made absolutely certain that Blacks did not. It's still, and other non-white communities. So housing discrimination has continued through and to today, where Minneapolis has, and unfortunately Minneapolis and the Twin Cities in general are known for, we're known on the one hand for our welfare and our, not just being nice, but supporting people. Unfortunately, the other side of that is we're known all too well for our extreme discrepancies and our racial gaps, and housing is one of them. So whites have, in Minneapolis in particular, have, I think, the highest house owning rate in the nation at 75%, and our Black families have one of the lowest. I think we only share that with Nashville, maybe one other city, at 23%. So that gap is still gigantic. And housing discrimination is both entrenched by and cascades into other sectors of life, such as economic inequity. And this shows the household income. The lower line is Black families, and the poverty rates, the upper line. Sorry, when I downloaded these, it took out the categories over here. So that's just what that is showing is the extreme discrepancies in overall poverty rates. There are also gaps in college education rates, student loan debt, loan default rates, and not surprisingly, left over for retirement, a lot left to leave for the next generation. And this is a lot of scholarship has come out on the cascading effect, and some of that has been in the newspapers. So there's also, however, along with all of these wage structures that are entrenched and not openly racialized, obviously, but in practice racialized, you also have much higher rates of industrial and environmental pollution. So again, Nikhil Anand mentions environmental injustices. This is part of it, that again, there's nothing that laws that seem neutral are obviously not, because has been known for decades now that polluting industries locate near poorer communities, and they are allowed to do so, and they are often supported by the state or municipalities for locating in low-income neighborhoods, because they bring money elsewhere or resources to other people. What that means is that even though you would think that pollution, because of wind and that sort of thing, is relatively evenly distributed, and it often looks that way, that more recent studies are more often showing that how untrue that is, that race, even more than socioeconomic class, determines how much particulates you are inhaling, and that poor communities in general have much higher rates of breathing in these effluviants, these small particulates and nitrogen dioxide that cause huge spikes in excess mortality rates. And not surprisingly, most recent studies are now showing higher risk of COVID-19 when you live in these neighborhoods and breathe this in and day out. So the point of all of this is to emphasize that what could be spaces of care are not, and it ends up with oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself, but actually this is what I want. Could be spaces of care as well as containment, that is reasonably healthy neighborhoods of home and resources and services and livable incomes and a relatively absence of pollutants are not. That's not what they want, what they are. And this, I meant to mention that, of course, part of the continuing neighborhood, poor neighborhood entrenchment is that there have been decades of both state, federal, municipal, and private disinvestment from these communities. And so it's hard to get businesses up and running. And there is simply very little support for supporting local businesses. What too often happens is, I don't need to tell any of you, is when money moves in, it's gentrification. It's private money, equity. It's for others to move in, gentrify, push the poor communities out, and that's what so often happens. So often happens in the United States. And so what this ends up with is, of course, higher death rates. And you can see that indigenous people are the ones that are growing the fastest. African Americans, Blacks, Pacific Islanders are also up there, and that is a continuing trajectory of as you see here. Then this was in March of this month in 2021. This is still going up, but the gaps are getting the gaps are getting broader, not smaller, as you can see there. So yes, instead of these, what could be spaces of care are not. And if we could have paradigms where this proactively addressing the inequalities, the histories of brutality, because we also have to add police brutality to this picture, and the studies on weathering that are coming out more and more now, that everyday racism itself has serious impacts on health. And this is that it impacts immune systems. We already noticed that even not under COVID, mental issues are higher, of anxieties, mental distress, experiencing these incidences of racism in your life every day. Maternal mortality rates, and again, unfortunately, Minnesota is #1 in the country for our Black maternal mortality rates. This has again cascading effects, that racism itself, or what is called weathering. So, and this is not to ignore the many and varied initiatives that are coming again from these communities of springing up to solve, or they're already there, and they adapt themselves to COVID and what needs to be done under COVID. But the point is to suggest that these initiatives they should be doing that hand in hand with support from the state and the city, instead of neglect from that. And then they could do that much more than they are already doing. And they're not doing it out of necessity and innovation out of perpetual crisis, but rather doing it because it's appropriate, it is contoured to their needs, etc. I also want to one more thing that surprised me, that was new to me when I was researching this, not just for this talk. My graduate student Tankut and I do have an article in the pipeline that is discussing some of this in more detail. That these disinvested neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, also average 5 degrees higher in temperature than other areas of cities because of the lack of green spaces and parks. And though that might seem immaterial or irrelevant, that causes significant spikes in mortality and heat stroke and that sort of thing. If anybody has read Eric Kleinenberg's book, Heat Wave, which is just so poignant about heat is incredibly deadly, particularly when you're already vulnerable. But these spaces of inequality and inequity are actually not contained. They impact other spaces of relative care, like we've seen during COVID of elder care facilities, which in themselves, much of what we've seen has been a lack of good management, provision of adequate PPE, enforcing CDC guidelines and all of that, but they also in turn have turned into COVID hotspots because care workers tasked with keeping our parents and our elderly relatives and friends and family safe are themselves paid unlivable wages. They are people of color, communities of color, have a disproportionate representation in the essential workers factions, and those essential workers could be the ones and this is in rural areas, so it's not just urban, of where meatpacking plants, I would never call spaces of care, but they become extremely precarious, deadly and at risk under COVID, because many companies, and this is variable, some have done better than others, but those have become hot spots of outbreaks because they have not provided, in most cases, adequate PPE, sick leave, livable wages, so that when you are sick, you stay home, and you know you're sick, you stay home. So going back to the elder care facilities is another example of that, and literally supposed to be spaces of care that when you pay people so little, you don't always provide them with adequate or appropriate PPE. And because of low wages, poor communities often live in crowded and multi-generational households. They often have another job. They are at higher risk. That is also how COVID has spiked in many of these facilities. And unfortunately, I know this all too well because my father, who was in an elder care independent living facility, got COVID and died of it at the end of January. So before I move on to my final point, what could be with addressing what I think you're gonna, I don't want to say a lot about it, racial capitalism, because I think you're hearing about it in the next talk, but addressing this could do so much to make neighborhoods and communities safe spaces themselves of care. And these factors that come together that I just described, including police brutality, is why we saw pictures like this after George Floyd's death. And this is in Minneapolis, right across the street from the police precinct, that they really do erupt in actual violence, not so slow from the decades of what, Anand was talking about, the decades of neglect and disinvestment and sometimes very explicit, sometimes implicit disdain of populations that are not deserving of care, and what that takes to maintain that, so that you don't have a literal or figurative conflagration on your hands. So my final case study is that a quick look at containment strategy with a lot of hype these days, which is the vaccine. If we haven't gotten it already, I haven't. We're all excited about it. We, many of us, check to see when our place in line is going to be up front, and we can go get our shots and we can feel more secure. But looking at this at the global level, the hype dies pretty quickly. And this is something that, again, I wrote about with my colleague, and so did many other people during the 2009 H1N1 pandemic. And here we all are, deja vu all over again, that while we are excited and feeling like finally we can get a figurative and actual shot in the arm soon and be done with this epidemic, the vast majority of people in the world are not going to get any vaccine anytime soon, probably not for another 2 or 3 years. Because what happens, the way that this works is that, that high-income countries pre-contract vaccine doses, and they buy them all up as soon as they become even promising. So months and months ago, when these were barely, beyond in some smart scientist's head, countries were lining up who could, and of course that's the EU, the US, Australia, Japan, et cetera, were lining up for their contracts, and they bought millions and millions of doses of vaccines, to the point where there was nothing left for people in the rest of the world. So low-income countries don't have the capital to do this, and so they don't do it. They're not able to do it. There was a new mechanism this time around called COVAX. You've probably heard about it. It was launched by the Global Vaccine Alliance, the WHO, and the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. And it was a tool where it was designed to get out of this rut of pre-contracts. And it was supposed to be a tool where all countries bought into it, all countries signed on to it, all countries put their money into it. And then when the vaccines were out and rolling out, they purchased their vaccines from it. But of course, it didn't work that way because it was voluntary. And on the one hand, you can't blame governments where they're going to be voted out of office if they don't say, well, my first priority is my own citizens, right? So of course, that's what I'm going to do. Of course, I'm going to pre-contract. But what that means is then everybody else gets voluntary donations of vaccines they'll end up not using, or everybody else has to wait for the manufacturing to keep up with the unbelievable number of doses that are going to be required with this. So the Duke University Global Health Innovation Center has a vaccine pre-purchase tracking program. And so here's what they've tracked, that the high income is in your salmon pink here over on the left. Needless to say, without naming even the numbers, which you should be able to read, I hope that they have far outstripped anybody else. And the last one on the right is COVAX. And so COVAX is sitting there at 1,120,000 versus the almost 5 billion doses purchased by high-income countries. So in the numbers, as of mid-January, so this is a little bit behind, 7 billion doses of vaccine had been purchased totally, globally, and 4.2 billion, or 60%, went to high-income countries. Some of these, and even though they represent 16% of the world's population, 60% of the vaccines, some countries, and this is showing this in a different way. So as you can see, our y-axis here is possible vaccination coverage. That's possible, all right? And our x-axis here is COVID burden. Canada has been picked on, understandably so. They are the champions. They've got, as you can see, they've got relatively low burden. They have enough vaccine doses to cover their entire population 5 times over. The US, which has high burden, but they also have, as you can see, 200. So we have enough now already to cover each and every one of us twice over. And then the worst one on here on this map was high burden San Marino and almost no vaccines. And, most of the rest are, crowded, you can see crowded in the corner there. So, why is this myopic? Well, I will end with whoops, sorry, I was trying to center that. I'll go back up. With the Deputy Director of the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Protection, Dr. Ahmed Ogwell, pointed out the dangerous myopia in this, and declaring that there is really no option but equitable distribution of vaccines. If we don't do that, then the virus will never go away, because the virus does not respect borders. This sort of skewed arrangement will not be good for public health, and will certainly open us up to even more spread of this virus in the future. I usually avoid this sort of we're all in this together thing, but that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is this, this is your choice. You can continue this unbelievably inequitable system that does not work. It works for you, but it doesn't work for us. And so if you really want to stop this virus and really contain it globally, then we need to figure this out and figure out a different system. So the infrastructures and other factors constituting these spaces, home, domestic spaces, municipal spaces, global spaces, as Anand suggests, do signal environmental justices and distribute life and harm, and they do demand an accounting of the world that recognizes how past histories of injustice are remade and realized anew. And Hinchliffe and his colleagues are right, I think, that pathological life is embedded in the multiple practices, ideologies, material, and institutional structures of places and spaces where extreme precarity, which happens in so many places under call them what turbo capitalism, racialized capitalisms, extractive capitalisms, fossil fuel capitalisms, neoliberalism. Those spaces are all over the world, and they are getting worse. The inequalities are getting worse. And where extreme precarity, therefore, turns into pathogenicity when you drop a microbe into it. These situations therefore become absolutely ripe for transmission. So I'm not arguing, I'll say it again, I'm not arguing for doing away with lockdowns or other public health measures. They do help for many, for all those though who have more help already with them. But I just feel that whether we're architects or urban planners or academics, social scientists, epidemiologists, that we're going to have to make better futures where spaces of care predominate, and that we're never going to get rid of, we can't get rid of epidemics per se, but we can certainly prevent some of the devastations. We can prevent some of the deaths that are happening now and are going to happen again in the future. But we have to confront the actual root causes, determining these spaces of harm and their complex multiplicities, and their complex timelines and geographic specificities. And we need to recognize that seriously and meaningfully addressing inequities and inequalities everywhere, because they do interrelate. So we can't just put it right in one space without doing so all over the place. That's going to be the most significant way to diminish pathological life and its attendant spaces. And in doing so, and I understand that sounds profoundly naive, but it needs to be said over and over and over again. And that's just the way that we're going to make better outcomes of future pandemics, and also actually prevent some of the damage if not much of the damage that's done to begin with. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Susan. I would like to open it up for questions. Okay, I see a lot of people on here. And yes, thank you. It's such a sort of, it's wide ranging, and I mean, you're right that these things bear repetition over and over again because they continue to persist. And I think you're drawing from these different frameworks. Again, that this kind of question sometimes seems new, perhaps in this year for many people. But as you're absolutely right that it's a question that people like you have been posing, and set of questions and then concerns which remain unanswered. But this kind of point you made about the window closing right now, but that the window still exists to repose those concerns with more urgency, I think is a really good point. I'd love to open up for questions. Carolyn.
Dr. Craddock, it's a pleasure to meet you. My name is Carolyn Acker. I'm retired from the history department at Carnegie Mellon. And I taught your book, Plagues and Cities, in my epidemics and public health history class.
Oh.
And I very much value your attention to urban geography. And one time, discussion of that book created a moment in the classroom that you cannot possibly plan for. And here's what happened. I divided the students up into groups based on where they lived. So all the ones who lived on campus were one group, all who lived in the neighborhood of Squirrel Hill, another group, and so forth. And I had them each draw a map of Pittsburgh that included only places at least one of them had been. And so certain ones were on pretty much every map, the campus itself, the South Side where nightlife is. But one neighborhood, Pittsburgh's Hill District, was conspicuously missing from almost every group. The Hill District was the setting of August Wilson's plays, historically poor Black neighborhood adjacent to downtown, inspiration of Hill Street Blues. And so I looked around and I said, none of these groups have the Hill District. Why not? Oh, the Hill. Oh, dangerous, scary. No, we wouldn't go there. But this group does have someone who goes to the Hill. Who's that? The one Black student in the class raised her hand. She had grown up in South Philadelphia, Black neighborhood of South Philadelphia. Oh, why do you go to the Hill? I go to church there. And so this place that was danger for all the white students, for her was sanctuary and refuge. So thank you for creating that opportunity.
No, thank you. It's a good exercise. That's smart.
I see Pinar.
Hi, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. I wanted to ask you, so I am a policy student, and we are specifically healthcare policy. And we talk a lot in our classes about, and I'm sure all CMU classes do, we talk a lot about data and how we can use data to shape policy decisions. And something that I'm thinking on a lot, after reading, actually we read the introduction to your book for Nita's class, and something that I'm thinking about is how we can translate these data skills into concrete policy recommendations that reflect the structural inequalities and power analyses that you write about. And so I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about, perhaps like two policy students like myself, like what, if you have any advice or guidance as to like how we can, bring those analyses into spaces where data kind of drives the conversation.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think what you need to do, because too often, and this might not be the case, but too often in health data, and this can be good, but it can also be not so good. And that is that so much health data is based on race or ethnicity, demographics, in other words. And as I don't need to tell you, there are controversies about that, right? There are reasons to do that so that we can not be blind to where those inequities are. And that's important. But on the other hand, what I have seen way too often in health data still is that the categorizations become risk groups, right? So it's being Black makes you at risk of this. Being Latinx makes you at risk of that. Well, that's what you can intervene in, Pinar. You can say, we need to figure out either different ways of collecting data, or if this is what we have, then we need to really contextualize it, because that is so destructive. That is so, and it brings us back to scapegoating. That's exactly what creates just ignorance and scapegoating and not doing what needs to be done. And so that's where we all, and that's why I'm careful to say, I'm not suggesting that initiatives coming from the communities, that's unnecessary and they shouldn't have to do that. Well, they know what's best for themselves. And so going to communities and saying, okay, let's actually sweep aside the data for right now and hear from you. What do you know is not working well in your communities, and explain it in your own words. That can be so powerful. And I'm not saying I hate romancing communities and they all speak in one word and, voice, and they're monolithic. Of course they're not, but that's what you need to join those two from the bottom up to actually disrupt that data, I think, and put it into human terms. Does that make sense?
Yes,
Maybe
absolutely.
Not very practical.
No, it makes a lot of sense. Actually, we just read something about algorithmic bias in my population health class. And, for example, when insurance companies are doing, risk assessments for like specialized programs, they often talk about how Black people have a higher risk of diabetes. But why?
Mm-hmm.
And so it definitely makes a lot of sense what you're saying.
Yeah, no, I have to say that it's in those instances that I just want to pound my head against the wall and just say, how many times do we social scientists have to say these things before it's listened to of how damaging data can be? So yeah, it's a really good question, a really good point.
Thank you for that answer. Thanks.
Yeah.
I mean, I could just, actually, Candice, please.
Thank you. For a few things. One, I wanted to say thank you for sharing your personal story about your father. It's for those of us who study things and analyze things that are close to our hearts. It's always bittersweet to share those, and I just wanted to acknowledge that and appreciate it.
Thank you.
The second is that I'm teaching a class called COVID Cultures this semester. I'm a humanist. I do literary and I guess literary analysis would be my main focus.
Okay.
And what I've noticed is largely missing in a lot of the data. So I tend to want to contextualize that data exactly as you mentioned, right? But what's missing oftentimes is the idea of culture, right? And so how do people go about existing in their communities is very different. And there doesn't seem to be any taking into consideration of those differences or those nuances. And so I did see a physician speak from University of Texas Dell Medical School. This was a few months ago, and something that she said really resonated with me. And I think this goes back to Pinar's question as well, which is, her name is Jewel Owen. And she said that until we build structures that have the understanding of inherent bias embedded in them, we are not going to solve the problem, because what's continuing to happen, and I believe this is, a variance of what you're saying, is that we're building these structures without taking into consideration the populations that they need to serve. Mm-hmm. And then we pat ourselves on the back midway through when someone pops up with the question of, well, what about X community? Mm-hmm. Oh, right. let's take a little bit of a right turn here. But
Mhm.
that's not sufficient until those
No.
conversations are in place from the beginning. Then our biases and all the data in the world isn't going to solve those issues. And so
Right.
I just wondered if you had any thoughts on ways that we can engage in conversations that are not so based on a Western ideology of space and
Mhm.
containment. That's my question and my comment all wrapped up into one, but thank you very much.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think what you have to think about is, again, the inequality. So, and not sure if I'm illustrating this in the way you wanted, but there's nothing wrong. For instance, I mentioned multi-generational housing. I hope it's obvious that I didn't mean there's something wrong with that. I mean, that's great. That's gorgeous when it works. Again, not to romanticize it, and that's all over the world, right? So spaces, yeah, I mean, our sense of space, meaning, I need lots of room. There's nothing inherently wrong with more compact housing, multi-generational housing. There's so much positive that can be said about that. But when you drop poverty into that, when you drop these other things into that, then they do become more pathological. And there's no value judgment about that. They just do for so many, again, pathogenic situations. And so I completely agree with you. I'm trying to remember, I'm terrible about remembering the pithy sayings that others can think of this, but that, our rules have to contain the most marginalized. If they can't adequately and appropriately address our most marginalized anywhere in the world, then they're not doing their job. And I think that's also what it is that we need to not be blind to who is the we that we're talking about, who is the we that we're encompassing, and who is the many, 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 many millions of we's that we're excluding with this. And it's mind-boggling. I mean, we're not talking about a small fraction of the world's population. We're talking about a huge fraction of the world's population. And so, and that is incredibly broad brushstroke, because obviously what that means, what poverty means, what exactly about poverty puts you at risk, can be extremely different in very localized areas, right? And so it's a giant task to do this, but it's what we have to start doing. We collectively, we in the United States, once again, and there are new lessons every pandemic, right? So the lessons this time in the US is done abysmally, and we can blame Trump for a good bit of that, but it's also just our unbelievable, chaotic patchwork way of getting things done, we're not going to do universal health care. That's socialism. So it's not keeping people alive. It's not getting more efficient if it's well done and well funded, more efficient systems that we can actually roll out PPE, and that we can actually figure out in our own cities and neighborhoods what you're doing, and not because we're on different computer systems. I mean, this was happening early on with the lab work and the getting PPE. It was like every health system uses a different computer system and computer program and platform, and they're unable to communicate, and it was completely ridiculous. So there's specificities also that increase efficiencies, and what the US needs to think about in addressing its inequities and poverty and deep rooted racisms is not exactly, say, I think of India, which had such a catastrophic lockdown, they have their own sets that overlap, but are very different in what we need to think about in terms of, you know, our spaces and how we utilize them and how we make them spaces of care, and the policies that we need, that we have got to think about in the non-pandemic time of how we do that. And I know you started out talking about culture, and I feel like I completely evaded that, and I don't know.
No.
Okay.
Not at all. I think you answered it because culture, you know, has to do with proximity, you know, familial linkage and practices. And I was specifically thinking about something as obvious as the spread of the disease in Mexico was in large part brought in by cruise ships of, you know, Anglos. And then those indigenous populations who were working in the Yucatan went back to their villages where they
the disease, which is like this strange conflation of post-colonialism, horribly tragic. And then a lot of people weren't taking into consideration that some of those indigenous villages have a large propensity for lung disease because they have huts in which they have open flame, right? Or they just don't have an infrastructure of water that is clean. And so does that make them less valuable to our society? No. You know, so there's a value judgment there that I really appreciate that you were trying to parse out, you know, that some things are value judgment, some things are just fact.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for your comment and your question.
I've been thinking of so many different things, but I just want to see if there's anyone else who has a question or any kind of, I mean, one thing that I was going back to the data question, I remembered actually a sort of a link between something that you said and something that Nosheen Anwar a couple of weeks ago when she presented about her research in Karachi. And a lot of a similar kind of intersection of factors, the kind of the assemblage of different factors and how they're playing out in the context of urban Karachi. But one thing that sort of resonated between both is this idea, not just of kind of how data becomes, you know, these categories that then become stereotypes or scapegoating, but also where data is absent and the fact that data itself doesn't exist, you know, is itself patchy, but may not appear so. And you mentioned that in relation to the statistics on domestic violence and why, you know, either reporting didn't happen, perhaps because of those proximities and lockdown measures, or because murders are not reported to the same extent, and you know, depending on people's, again, how lives are valued in certain ways, that makes it into data. And she also mentioned kind of a parallel kind of examples on how kind of data on displacements or demolitions of very precarious housing conditions that the state or the municipal kind of authorities have been involved in, that data of how many people were displaced or how many people lost their homes either prior to or during COVID just doesn't exist. And so that gap or that kind of patchwork, again, in a very different type of infrastructure, then becomes operationalized for whatever policy end, but doesn't take into account that. I mean, I'm just kind of thinking across like what you mentioned and what the possible, I mean, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what the possible implications of those gaps, say in the case of, you know, missing domestic violence data can be, you know, as they kind of compound towards within policy effects.
What was the last word you just said?
How they kind of compound in policy effects, like down the road, or policy landscapes.
Right. Well, I mean, that goes back to, you know, Pinar's question, one of my responses, which on the one hand, we do need data, you know, numbers are powerful. And so when we don't have them at all, then that's when you can absolutely neglect and you can pretend like it doesn't exist. And you can bypass it entirely. And that is exceedingly dangerous. And that's why, and I will add to, there was another woman whose name, I have it in my notes that I took on, at that workshop, but I don't have it in front of me, but she was from Mexico, talking about Mexico. And from her perspective, as you just suggested, is that some of that is first getting it to be a problem to begin with, that even femicide is of the, okay, right. And domestic violence, just like we had to decades ago of saying, no, domestic violence isn't part of marriage, that isn't private, that, you know, we had our own struggles with getting that to be an issue. And having numbers that say, here's the extent, this is not a small problem, this is a huge problem. Femicide is not a word you hear every day, and in part because those numbers don't exist. And I think if we knew how actually severe and frequent femicide was, we would probably, I'm sorry to say, be aghast at how widespread it is. And this is what, I have to look up her name again. Simonovich was her last name. That, you know, she said, and why her job right now is not even, which I'm sure must be frustrating for her. She didn't suggest this, but she can't do anything about femicide right now because she has to put all of her time and effort into getting databases so that we have something to go with, and to go by, and to start a campaign of saying this is how extensive it is. It's just like the third person on that panel was Nicole was her name, and I forget what I think she was in the public health system, the Indian public health system, Native American, I should say. And she, you know, her job is trying to count the disappeared number of Native American women, and can't get anybody to do that. I mean, literally, they don't have the facility. They're doing their best. They know enough to know that it's usually the problem, whether they're murdered, whether they're, you know, whatever has happened to them. And these are hundreds of women. They know that it's mainly white men or non-American Indian men, but nobody else outside of the reservation system thinks it's high priority enough. And so there's just explicit, overt, mind-boggling devaluation of Native American women's lives there. And to just get the numbers to start a campaign is where it's where you have to begin. And so doing that is extremely important, even though, as I suggested with Pinar Nova's, numbers can also be very controversial. And it's also tough, you know, even in the US, that's another thing that you would think we would have figured out by now, but that it's hard for us to cross compare because how we collect data goes by state, right? So even collecting pandemic data, so a lot of our health data, as you were saying, Pinar, and I was saying, is disaggregated by demographic, but our pandemic data is not. And that took some people to say, I kind of think we need this. I kind of think, because it is such a narrative to say that we're all at risk of viruses, we're all equally at risk. That's the narrative. And to show, and I think that impulse came from countries that have been keeping track, like Canada and New Zealand, I think, were countries that had the data to say, yeah, no, not really. Our Aboriginal, our First Nation people are dying, and this was again H1N1 at like 5 times, 6 times the rate of white communities. And I think that's what's finally driving. I think we're up to 19 states are now, they're still not all of the states are collecting data by demographics. Maybe it might be more than 19, but it's certainly not all 50. And again, what are we going to do with that? So that brings us to what do we do with that is the next point. Minnesota now we're just as discrepant, if not more so, again, than any other state. What can we do about that? Because now, of course, we have discrepant vaccine rates, right?
Yeah, it goes back to the kind of underlying causes that you were mentioning.
Yeah. Which I didn't mention, but like distrust of the medical, most non-white communities have distrust of medical establishment, and absolutely well-founded. And so how do you, we know in part, there was just a pediatrician, African-American pediatrician saying, please don't, this goes back to a determinist culture, Candace, which is, please, this one was saying, please do not say that Blacks don't believe in vaccines or they don't get vaccines. They come to me for vaccines, so don't say that. It's how do we get over their distrust? How do we heal those deep-seated wounds where history does repeat itself? So sorry, you were, I think, gonna wrap this up, but I just
what I was, exactly what I was saying was that I think you ended your talk with this, the idea that it comes back to a whole lot of that kind of grouping of structural factors that need to sort of be reattended to all the time. And thank you so much. Really fantastic presentation, and thank you for engaging in a whole series of points about this. We really appreciate it, Susan.
Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed the discussion and your questions and hearing a little tiny bit about the work that you're doing. So thank you very much.
Continue the conversation. Thank you everyone else for joining as well.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.